Chapter 3. The Data. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Teddy discovered this by taking a sip and nearly spitting it across her keyboard. She set the mug aside without looking, her eyes still fixed on the laptop screen. Day 4. Or was it 5? The timeline had gotten fuzzy somewhere around the 70-second sonar image when she'd stopped tracking the hours and started tracking the patterns instead. The patterns. God, the patterns. She'd run every debunking test she knew. Acoustic artifacts from the survey equipment, interference from the ship's electrical systems, side lobe contamination, calibration drift, operator error. She'd even spent 6 hours researching the specific model of multibeam sonar the Germans had used, downloaded the manufacturer's specifications, and calculated the theoretical resolution limits at 2,400 meters depth. The structures were still there. Every time she looked, they were still there. Teddi pushed back from her desk and stood, her spine cracking in 3 places as she straightened. The apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers had colonized the kitchen counter, forming a civilization of their own. Her bed was buried under printouts, charts, bathymetric profiles she'd sketched by hand when the screen started giving her headaches. The wine bottle she'd opened that first night sat empty on the windowsill, joined by 2 of its siblings. She should shower, eat something that wasn't cold noodles, maybe step outside and remember what sunlight felt like. Instead, she walked to the wall where she'd taped up the enlarged sonar returns and stared at them for the 100th time. The grid was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Not a perfect grid, not the precise right angles of modern urban planning, but regular, intentional. Streets, or what might have been streets, crossing at intervals that varied within a consistent range. Between them, rectangular formations that could have been buildings. Foundations, maybe, or the compressed remnants of whatever construction material had lasted 12,000 years under crushing pressure and sediment. She traced one of the main arteries with her finger, following it from the edge of the survey zone toward the center. The Germans had focused their attention on the hydrothermal vents to the southeast, which meant their coverage of this area was incidental, sloppy. They'd been pointed at something else and accidentally captured the edges of something they shouldn't have been able to see at all. That was the part that bothered her. Or one of them. The acoustic baffles. Teddi had noticed it on the second day, running comparative analysis between the German data and her own archived research from her doctoral work. The same region, 6 years apart. Her data had shown something, yes. Anomalies that had gotten her labeled a crank, but nothing like this. Nothing this clear. Either the Germans had much better equipment than she'd had, true, but not enough to explain the difference, or something about the acoustic properties of the site had changed. She'd written "degraded concealment" in her notebook at 3 a.m., then stared at the words until they stopped making sense. Concealment implied someone doing the concealing. She wasn't ready for that logical leap yet. She wasn't ready for a lot of the logical leaps this data kept demanding. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She picked it up just to silence it and saw 7 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, plus a text from her mother that started with, "Teodora, please call me, I'm worried," and ended with something about Christmas that Teddi deleted without reading. She put the phone face down on the counter and returned to the wall. The acoustic signatures were the key. She'd spent most of day 3 focused on that, pulling apart the German data to isolate the return characteristics of different materials. Sediment produced one pattern, volcanic basalt produced another. The thermal vents themselves created noise that required filtering. And the structures produced something else entirely. The returns were too strong for sediment-covered formations, too coherent for natural rock. The acoustic impedance suggested something dense, uniform, worked. She kept coming back to the same word, even though it felt insane to apply it to something at the bottom of the Atlantic. Masonry. Not quarried stone, not exactly. Nothing that matched the acoustic profiles she'd built up over 15 years of surveying the ocean floor. But close. Close enough that she'd pulled out her graduate textbooks and spent hours comparing the German returns to documented profiles of ancient stone construction from terrestrial archaeological sites. The match wasn't perfect, but it was closer than any natural explanation she could construct. Teddi returned to her laptop and opened the file she'd been avoiding. The central formation, the dense acoustic return at the heart of the grid, where all the streets converged. Whatever it was big, oblong and massive, with dimensions she'd estimated at approximately 400 meters by 300 meters based on the survey coverage. The returns suggested multiple levels, or maybe just extreme density, something that had been important enough to place at the center of everything else. A temple, part of her whispered. A palace. A parliament. A fantasy, the scientific part of her countered. You're seeing what you want to see. But she wasn't. That was the thing. She didn't want to see this. She'd spent 5 years carefully not wanting to see this, carefully rebuilding her career around the assumption that her doctoral research had been flawed, that she'd been wrong, that the anomalies she'd documented were explainable by natural processes she hadn't properly considered. This wasn't want. This was the data refusing to be anything other than what it was. She pulled up another analysis window and started a new calculation. The grid pattern covered approximately 7 square kilometers based on the German survey data. But the survey data was incomplete. They'd been mapping vents, not looking for structures. They'd only captured the edges. If the pattern extended at the same density across the entire formation, her fingers moved across the keyboard, translating assumptions into math. Grid density times probable extent. Structural footprint times estimated building count. Population capacity based on terrestrial archaeological analogs. She used the conservative estimates, the ones that assumed half the structures were warehouses or workshops rather than dwellings. The ones that assumed modest household sizes, nothing like the dense tenement living of later Mediterranean cities. The number came up, 247,000. She stared at it, ran the calculation again, changed 2 variables, made them even more conservative. 212,000. Teddi sat back from the keyboard. The cursor blinked at the end of the number, patient and indifferent. 200,000 people, minimum. In a city that had drowned when the ice sheets melted, when humanity was supposed to be scattered bands of hunter-gatherers chipping flint and chasing mammoths across frozen tundra. Athens at its classical peak, the glory of Pericles and the Parthenon, had held maybe 250,000. Rome, at the height of empire, touched 1 million, but that was the accumulated achievement of centuries of civilization building on civilization. This was older than Göbekli Tepe, older than the first permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, older than agriculture itself, according to the conventional timeline. And it had been bigger than classical Athens. Teddi sat back and stared at the screen until her eyes watered. The fado music from the bar down the street had started up again. She hadn't noticed it stopping. Night had become day, had become night again, and she'd lost track somewhere in between. She needed to tell someone. The thought surfaced for the 1,000th time, and for the 1,000th time, she pushed it back down. Tell who? Her former colleagues at NOAA, who'd watched her dissertation defense turn into a professional execution? The academic community that had blacklisted her for suggesting the same things this data was now proving? Aurelio, who'd disappeared into whatever paranoid nightmare had driven him to her door in the first place? The memory of his warning crept back. Marta Sousa, 29 years old, single vehicle accident, no witnesses. 3 days after sending an email about anomalies in the German survey data. Teddi walked to the window and looked out at the air conditioning unit and the peeling azulejo tiles. The street below was quiet. A few tourists wandering back to their hotels. A stray cat investigating something in the gutter. Nothing unusual. Nothing she could see, anyway. She found herself checking the locks on her door. Then checking them again. Then pulling up the network settings on her laptop to verify, for the 3rd time that day, that she wasn't connected to anything. The data lived on an encrypted drive, air-gapped from the world. She'd disabled the laptop's wireless card at a hardware level, paranoid enough now to distrust software solutions. This was what Aurelio had warned her about. Not the discovery itself, but what it would do to her. The isolation, the fear, the slow slide from rigorous scientist to conspiracy theorist, seeing threats in every shadow because the alternative was admitting that maybe, just maybe, the world was exactly as boring and explicable as everyone wanted to believe. She wasn't there yet. She kept telling herself she wasn't there yet, but she could see the edge from where she was standing. Day 5 blurred into day 6. She woke at some point on the floor beside her desk, cheek pressed against a bathymetric printout, the taste of stale coffee coating her tongue. She'd been dreaming about pressure, about darkness, about something vast and patient waiting in the deep. Teddi stopped leaving the apartment entirely, surviving on delivery food and the dregs of instant coffee she found in the back of a cabinet. She mapped the entire survey zone by hand, transferring the sonar data to graph paper because something about the physical act of drawing made the patterns more real. Her walls became a gallery of impossible architecture. Streets, buildings, infrastructure. A city that had drowned when the ice sheets melted and humanity was still hunting mammoths with stone-tipped spears. The timeline kept haunting her. 12,000 years minimum, possibly older, depending on the exact sea level data you trusted. The Younger Dryas had been a complicated period, climatologically speaking. The conventional wisdom said the flooding had been rapid, but not instantaneous. Centuries, maybe, for the full transition. But conventional wisdom didn't account for whatever had built this city. On the morning of day 7, or what she assumed was morning, based on the light filtering around her blinds, Teddi made a decision. She couldn't prove anything from this apartment. The German data was compelling but incomplete. The survey coverage was incidental, the resolution limited, the interpretation necessarily speculative. To prove this was real, to document it in a way that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed, she needed primary data. Her own eyes on the ocean floor, her own instruments, her own verification. She needed to go there. The thought had been circling for days, but she'd kept pushing it away because it was impossible. Deep-sea survey work required ships, submersibles, crews, millions of dollars in equipment, institutional backing that she absolutely did not have. But sitting on her cluttered desk, buried under printouts and empty coffee cups, was a business card she'd kept for 3 years without quite knowing why. Teddi dug it out and stared at the name embossed in silver on black cardstock. Niels Brennan. Founder, Brennan Oceanic. She'd met him at a conference in Monaco, back when she still got invited to conferences. Swedish-American, old tech money that he'd multiplied through a combination of early social media investments and what he called frontier science initiatives. The scientific establishment despised him. He funded fringe researchers, heterodox archaeologists, anyone with a theory too wild for mainstream academia. Graham Hancock was reportedly on his Christmas card list. His projects ranged from the merely unconventional to the actively embarrassing, and any discovery associated with his name would be tainted by that association before the first paper was published. But he was also, by most accounts, smarter than his public persona suggested. And he'd offered, drunk at the conference bar at 2 a.m., to fund her dissertation research after hearing about her preliminary findings. "Everyone's so afraid of finding something real," he'd said, his eyes too bright in a way that could have been enthusiasm or just the champagne. "They'd rather keep publishing safe papers about things that don't matter. You're different. You actually want to know." She'd turned him down. At the time, she'd still believed the academic system would vindicate her, still believed that good data and rigorous methodology would triumph over institutional inertia. She'd been wrong about that. Maybe she'd been wrong to turn him down too. Teddi set the card next to her laptop and stared at it for a long time. Brennan was problematic. His money came from sources that made environmental activists and responsible scientists uncomfortable. His projects were often more about publicity than research. Taking his funding would mean accepting tainted money and probably surrendering some control over how any discoveries were announced. But he had ships, submersibles, the resources to actually investigate what she'd found. And he'd already demonstrated 3 years ago that he wasn't afraid of controversial findings. The alternative was to keep staring at sonar returns in her apartment until the food ran out and her savings account hit zero. Or to try approaching legitimate institutions, which would mean exposing herself to the same academic machinery that had destroyed her career the first time around. Aurelio's warning echoed in her head. "Don't tell anyone what you're working on. I'm being watched." But Aurelio hadn't given her any way forward. He'd dumped this data in her lap and disappeared, leaving her to figure out what to do with information that could change human history, or get her killed, depending on who was doing the watching and why. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here forever. Teddi picked up her phone and stared at it. Brennan's card was 3 years old. The number might not even work anymore. He might not remember her. He might have moved on to some other obsession, lost interest in ocean mysteries in favor of space tourism or AI development or whatever billionaires were currently spending their money on. But she had to try. She dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it. It rang 4 times, then connected to a voice that was definitely not Niels Brennan. "Brennan Oceanic, how may I direct your call?" "I'm trying to reach Niels Brennan. My name is Teodora Varga. We met at the Monaco Oceanography Conference 3 years ago." A pause. "Mr. Brennan's schedule is very full. If you'd like to leave a message." "Tell him I found what I was looking for. He'll know what that means." Another pause, longer this time. "One moment, please." Hold music. Some kind of ambient electronic thing that sounded vaguely aquatic. Teddi paced her cluttered apartment, stepping over printouts and empty containers, waiting for the line to disconnect. Instead, a different voice came on. Male. American accent with a hint of something else. Maybe Australian. Familiar. "Dr. Varga, it's been a while." "Mr. Brennan, I wasn't sure you'd remember me." "Yep. You told me there were structures at the bottom of the Atlantic that shouldn't exist, and then walked away when I offered to help you prove it. Not the kind of conversation I forget." She could hear the smile in his voice, the enthusiasm. "Your message said you found something." Teddi looked at her wall of sonar returns, the impossible grid, the drowned streets of a city older than civilization. "I found something," she said, "and I need to go see it for myself. I need a ship, equipment, funding, the kind of resources you have, and I don't. What's in it for me? The chance to prove that everything we think we know about human history is wrong?" A laugh, short and sharp. "You know what I love about you, Dr. Varga? You don't undersell. Most scientists come to me asking for money to study coral reefs or thermal vents. Important work, sure, but they frame it like they're asking permission. You come to me with the greatest archaeological discovery in history, and you treat it like you're doing me a favor by letting me participate. Am I wrong?" Silence for a moment. Then, "Where do you need to go?" "The Azores Plateau, northwest sector, depth around 2,400 meters. Her father's face surfaced unbidden. The way he'd looked that last morning on Lake Erie, checking his regulator with the easy confidence of a man who'd made 1,000 dives. 40 meters had killed him. Equipment failure, they said. Could have happened to anyone. She'd been 19, watching from the boat, when his partner came up alone and screaming. 2,400 meters. 60 times deeper than the water that had taken her father. Pressure that would crush a human body to pulp in seconds. Darkness so complete that light itself became a foreign concept. She was asking to go there. To see what waited in the deep. "Same area as your dissertation research," Brennan said. "Same area, better data, much better data." "And you can't tell me where you got this better data." "I can tell you it's legitimate. I can tell you I've spent a week verifying it. I can tell you it shows things I never saw in my own research, things I can't explain by any natural process I know." She hesitated. "And I can tell you that people may have died because of it, which means there's risk involved, for both of us." Another pause. When Brennan spoke again, his voice had shifted. Still enthusiastic, but with something harder underneath. Dr. Varga, I've made 3 fortunes by investing in things other people thought were too risky to touch. Risk doesn't scare me. Boredom scares me. Mediocrity scares me. Risk is just the price of admission to anything actually interesting. Is that a yes? That's a, let's meet in person and you can show me what you've got. I'm in London for the next few weeks. How soon can you get here? Teddi looked around at her disaster of an apartment. At herself, unwashed and exhausted and running on caffeine and obsession. At the impossible data plastered across her walls. London. She'd have to pack the data, figure out how to transport an encrypted drive through airport security without triggering questions she couldn't answer. Tomorrow, she said. I can fly out tomorrow. Good. I'll have someone meet you at Heathrow. Text me your flight details when you've booked. A pause. And Dr. Varga? Whatever you found, keep it between us until we've talked. I don't share well. The line went dead. Teddi lowered the phone and realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, exactly. More like the tremor that came after too much caffeine and too little sleep, the body finally registering stress that the mind had been too busy to notice. She'd done it. Made the call, crossed the threshold, set something in motion that couldn't be unset. Niels Brennan was not a safe choice. His reputation preceded him. His funding of fringe science meant any discovery he touched would be dismissed before anyone looked at the evidence. Association with him could finish what remained of her academic credibility. But he could get her to the bottom of the Atlantic. He could give her the resources to prove what the data was telling her. And once she had that proof, documented and undeniable, she could worry about what came next. She walked to the window again, looking out at Lisbon, preparing for another evening. The fado music was starting up. The tourists were emerging for dinner. Somewhere out there, maybe, someone was watching her apartment, noting her movements, waiting to see what she'd do with the impossible information that had fallen into her hands. She thought about Marta Sousa, 29 years old, dead in a car accident that wasn't an accident. She thought about the city at the bottom of the ocean, older than history, waiting to be found by someone brave enough or stupid enough to look. Tomorrow, she'd fly to London, show Brennan what she had, negotiate terms that would either save her career or destroy whatever remained of it. But tonight, she'd take a shower, maybe eat something real, try to sleep for a few hours before the next phase of her life began. The data would still be there in the morning, the impossible grid, the drowned streets, the evidence of something that should not exist but did. Teddi turned away from the window and started picking up the worst of the mess. One step at a time, survive the night, make it to tomorrow. Everything else was just details. Outside, Lisbon continued its eternal performance of light and music, and lives lived at the surface of things. And 2,400 meters below the Atlantic, in darkness that had lasted 12,000 years, the oldest city in the world kept its secrets.
This is the oldest country. I'm releasing it as serialized audio. If you want to continue, follow or subscribe.